I'm Jack Bradley in for Steve Lance tonight. President Trump proposing cutting non-defense spending by more than $160 billion in his new budget plan. His proposal calls for boosting funds for defense and the border and slashing funding for progressive initiatives. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more.
President Trump's White House on Friday sent Congress its budget blueprint for the fiscal year of 2026. It prioritizes dismantling what it calls a weaponized federal bureaucracy and eliminating funding for progressive initiatives. Specifically, it recommends Congress slash federal funding on key non-defense programs by $163 billion, targeting programs related to DEI, critical race theory, and the Green New Deal. One of the largest savings comes from cuts to foreign aid by almost $50 billion as the USAID is folded into the State Department. The White House this week touted President Trump's actions to take on the status quo in Washington.
He has taken on every entrenched power structure and system all across this government, this swamp, this town. That includes, of course, the DOGE efforts to slash corrupt, wasteful government spending, graft, and corruption, and to stop billions of taxpayer dollars from going to radical left NGOs. These are left-wing nonprofits.
The Office of Budget and Management says it worked with the Department of Government Efficiency led by Elon Musk to identify what it calls woke and wasteful spending. On the other hand, the budget blueprint also calls for boosting defense spending by 13% to $1 trillion and increasing the funding for the Department of Homeland Security by 65%. It comes as the administration doubles down on closing the border and deporting illegal immigrants.
The number of illegal border crossers released into the United States is down, listen to this please, 99.999%.
That said, the White House's budget proposal is just recommendations for Congress. Lawmakers still hold the power of the purse, and some Republican senators are voicing their dismay with the newly released budget plan by saying there should be more funding for defense. Reporting by Iris Tao, NTD News.
The battle between the Trump administration and Harvard University heats up as the president again threatens to revoke their tax-exempt status. NTD's Arlene Richards has more on the legal dispute.
President Trump on Friday ramping up his threat to remove Harvard's tax-exempt status. In a Truth Social post, the president repeats a previous threat against Harvard, saying we are going to be taking away Harvard's tax-exempt status. This time, he adds, it's what they deserve. The White House's Joint Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism last month announced a freeze of more than $2 billion in Harvard's federal research funding. The move was part of the administration's aim to eliminate anti-Semitism on college campuses over the war in Gaza. The school sued for release of the money. A Harvard spokesperson told CNN there's no legal basis to rescind Harvard's tax-exempt status. Education Secretary Linda Mehan wants to resolve the problem.
Well, we're negotiating with them. When we went back to them to say we welcome them back to the negotiating table, their response was a lawsuit.
Harvard's president has said the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. Harvard admits in recent reports that anti-Semitism is a major problem on its campus, but it disagrees with how the problem should be solved, saying the school can apply its own reforms without oversight from the White House. President Trump took a swipe at Harvard in a recent commencement speech at the University of Alabama.
It is clear to see the next chapter of the American story will not be written by the Harvard Crimson. It will be written by you, the Crimson Tide.
Critics say federal law bars members of the executive branch from requesting that the IRS investigate Harvard. The IRS says in one of its publications that it receives complaints from a variety of sources, including members of Congress and federal government agencies. It does at times revoke tax exemptions if organizations violate the criteria, such as conducting activities that violate fundamental public policy. Those groups can appeal the agency's decision in court. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
The president is ending taxpayer funding for NPR and PBS. To discuss the future of media, we have on Curtis Houck, managing editor of NewsBusters. Curtis, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Now, you manage a media platform and have written extensively about media bias. The president signed an executive order Thursday night to end taxpayer funding for NPR and PBS. What's your reaction to this move?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that my colleagues at the Media Research Center, particularly our founder and president, Brent Bozell, and my boss, executive editor Tim Graham, have been fighting for 30 years. This is something that Republicans, conservatives have been campaigning on for decades, saying that we are going to remove taxpayer dollars for PBS and NPR, not the least of which because we live in a different age. You know, things like NTD weren't around 30 years ago. 40 years ago. There's far more choice in the media landscape, especially thanks to the internet. And also, too, there's the political bias as well that we've chronicled over the years as well, of which we view is biased towards the left, and it's anti-American, and it's very divisive with a very monotone voice. So we believe they should be able to stand on their own 2 feet.
And Trump's executive order says, quote, no media outlet has a constitutional right to taxpayer subsidies, and the government is entitled to determine which categories of activities to subsidize. Is it within the president's authority to make this call?
I mean, absolutely. I think that, you think about this. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the kind of, if you think of it as almost the parent company of the two, the board is appointed by presidents of the United States. The money that is given to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting comes from our taxpayer dollars. So you would think that we should have a say in this. And what the president's executive order is arguing, it is violating the law because it is not serving the public good because of its biased programming. So it is directing the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to cease all direct and indirect funding using taxpayer dollars. And it directs agencies that give grants, community grants, to PBS and NPR as well, such as HUD, HHS, the National Endowment for Humanities, to remove all direct and indirect fundings as well. This will be fought in the courts, just like really any issue since January 20th. So stay tuned for that, because this is really only the first step of which could be a years-long battle.
And Curtis, when Congress established the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in 1967, it specifically tried to insulate public media from political pressure. How have networks like NPR and PBS evolved over the years?
Yeah, I mean, as I pointed out earlier, there's choice. It used to just be 3 television networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. NPR was one of the predominant news sources out there, and your local paper. And that was really it. And we have so much more choice in this industry. And if you look specifically at NPR and PBS, their personalities, it's almost a revolving door with network and cable news. They go to write for other papers. Folks on MSNBC are former anchors on PBS and vice versa, and so on and so forth. So it's an almost incestuous relationship that we believe the Media Research Center has to come to an end. And any sort of arrangement with taxpayer dollars going to fund biased programming, which we did not consent to the American people, even though some Americans may agree with it, not everybody does, this would be considered a racket, or as my colleague Dan Schneider said, a criminal enterprise if it weren't, a government-sanctioned operation. It has just outgrown its usefulness. There's so much more choice. And if it is so popular and is so sterling reputation as they claim, they should be able to fund their own operations.
The White House also said in this order, government funding of news media in this environment is not only outdated and unnecessary, but corrosive to the appearance of journalistic independence. Curtis, do you believe that government funding should stay out of media entirely?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely the key, that, the government should not be picking winners and losers here in our media landscape. There's a reason why, if you ask Tim Graham's late father, who worked in local media in Wisconsin, he would have told you that the NPR affiliate had the best equipment. They had the fancy studios compared to private organizations that had to actually earn revenue. They had to create revenue. They had to earn advertisers. PBS, NPR have the government backstop, and they've taken advantage of that. And we've shown in study after study, whether it's coverage of LGBT issues, coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests, or even just a simple guest count that we did late 2022 into 2023. On the PBS NewsHour, there were 126 Democrat or liberal guests versus 34 conservative Republicans. And our study that's been going around the broadcast network, positive negative coverage we've done on PBS as well of the conventions last year, it was a very similar story. Negative for the RNC, positive for the DNC. It is high time that they have to compete in the fair free market, just like MSNBC, and they've taken advantage of this goodwill that was set up for them a lifetime ago.
Curtis Houck, thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate your perspective today.
Thanks, Ian.
Now, to break down the new jobs report and the state of the economy, we welcome on Paul Winfrey, President and CEO of the Economic Policy Innovation Center. Paul Winfrey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the latest job numbers show an increase of about 177,000 jobs added in April. This beats projections. It shows the Trump administration is praising these numbers as showing that they're responding well to his policies. This is despite tariffs, the concern that could induce a slowdown in the economy. How should we interpret these numbers?
Well, first of all, I think it's no doubt that those are strong jobs numbers. I mean, they came in over what we expected the jobs numbers to be at. At the same time, we saw strong wage growth as well, right off of the heels of the GDP report that came out earlier this week that showed that the economy may actually be contracting and that prices may be going up. But the major takeaway that I had from the jobs report this morning is that wage growth is actually higher than the price increases that we saw on Wednesday's report. So that's a good thing for workers. Now, what that might mean as well is that we're not seeing the true effects of the tariffs yet. Those may show up later this summer. But ultimately, I think that this is a really strong jobs report, and it's something that the administration should be proud of.
And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has cautioned against relying on sentiment surveys, how Americans are feeling about the economy, and instead to look at strong labor and spending data instead of, in the recent jobs report. Is the recent jobs report a true reflection of how Americans are experiencing the economy? And also, what signals should we watch?
Yeah, I think that the jobs report is an important indicator for how Americans are experiencing the economy, because it shows whether or not they're employed or not. At the same time, labor force participation went up. But again, one of the things that we're struggling with right now in looking at and interpreting the economic data is whether or not the effects of some of the early tariff policy that the administration was engaging in has, shown up in the job market, has shown up in some of these other economic indicators, and it's just too early to tell, right?
And some economists warn still that tariffs could lead to an economic slowdown. Could we see signs of an economic deceleration in the coming months?
We certainly could see an economic deceleration. Again, I think that we're starting to see that show up. That was reflected in this week's GDP report. But at the same time, it's too early to tell. And you're seeing this in some of the comments from the federal economic policy makers. For instance, the Federal Reserve. So the Fed has said that it doesn't feel like it's in a position to cut rates. It's waiting to see what happens with the tariffs and the price increases that may follow from the tariffs. But at the same time, they're not willing to move in the other direction as well. So it's sort of a wait and see what happens in the next few months.
China says that it's currently assessing U.S. proposals, but before trade talks begin, they want the U.S. to remove all tariffs. What leverage does the U.S. have here?
I think that the U.S. has a tremendous amount of leverage within regards to, trying to reset the trade agenda, throughout the world, right? But in order to win this trade negotiation that we're ultimately going to have with China, we're also going to have to leverage all of those other negotiations that we're having with these other countries to all point our fire at China, right? To make sure that folks realize that that's where the actual opportunity is.
U.S. imports are expected to fall 20% in the second half of 2025, with Chinese imports dropping as much as 85%. How resilient is the U.S. market, and what might American businesses, when might they be able to step up to meet U.S. manufacturing demand?
Oh, I think it depends on what type of manufacturing we're talking about. I think that if we're talking about replacing everything that we import right now from China and from other countries, it's going to take years. At the same time, again, if the administration is using its tariff policy and really its international economic policy to reset the trade agenda and to reset the international dynamics of the global economy, then ultimately I think we're still going to be able to get imports from other places to be able to make up for lost supply from certain places, including China. But if we're talking about replacing everything that we're getting from China as well as everything that we're getting from other countries, I mean, ultimately it would take years.
Let's move to the debt ceiling now. How much debt can the U.S. realistically carry, and what practical steps might be taken in the upcoming budget resolution so that the U.S. can be on a sustainable fiscal path?
Well, that's a really big question. So some of my research suggests that the U.S. can borrow up to about 150% of GDP in marketable debt. Right now, we're at about 90% of GDP in marketable debt. So that suggests that we can borrow about 60% of GDP going forward. That's about $18 trillion, somewhere in that ballpark. So that's a reasonable amount of debt capacity. At the same time, we can continue to build new debt capacity by growing the economy and engaging in economic policy that keeps interest rates low over the long run. If the economy keeps growing and interest rates stay where they are right now, under the Congressional Budget Office's baseline, we'll start to erode debt capacity sometime around 2029 or 2030. That gives me great pause because at that point, we're going to enter a debt spiral and Congress is going to have to respond to it. So the most important thing that Congress can do right now to prevent that from happening is to cut spending. And fortunately, that's what Congress is looking at doing right now as they consider the reconciliation bill.
Paul Winfrey, thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.